The morning of June 6, 1944 arrived without warmth or mercy. Before sunrise, the English Channel churned under a low gray sky, its surface broken by wind, rain, and the weight of history pressing down on every hull. Allied invasion fleets stretched to the horizon, silhouettes packed tight, engines idling, decks slick with salt and fear. Somewhere beyond the darkness lay Normandy, steel obstacles, mine shallows, and fortified bluffs waiting in silence. A U.S. Coast Guard cutter rode the swell at the edge of the assault lanes, its hull shuddering as waves slammed against reinforced steel. The ship was small by naval standards, but its assignment was anything but. Painted gray and stripped for war, the cutter carried trained surfmen, deck crews, and rescue specialists, men whose orders placed them closest to the shore, closest to drowning soldiers, and closest to incoming fire. On deck, crewmen gripped railings and lifelines as the cutter pitched violently. Helmets were pulled low. Kapok life jackets were cinched tight. Saltwater-soaked wool uniforms before a single shot was fired. The air reeked of fuel oil, wet rope, and cold iron. Overhead, the distant thunder of naval guns rolled inland, shaking the sea itself. As first light crept across the water, the shoreline revealed its shape. Dark bluffs. Jagged obstacles. Surf exploding against steel hedgehogs driven deep into the sand. The beach was no longer an idea, it was a target. Landing craft surged forward in tight formations, engines roaring, ramps rattling, packed with soldiers clutching rifles, packs, and prayers. Some boats wallowed too low. Others drifted off course. Many would never reach land intact. The cutter moved closer. Much closer. Orders demanded it. This was the zone where men vanished beneath waves, where damaged craft capsized, where survival depended on seconds. The cutter's bridge tracked the surf line, calculating distances while spray smashed across the windows. Every man aboard understood the rule: if a soldier went into the water here, someone had to go after him, no matter the fire. Machine gun tracers began stitching the water near the beach. Explosions threw pillars of foam into the air. Shrapnel hissed past the bow. The calm was gone. The invasion had begun, and the cutter was already inside its most dangerous hours. Ahead, the surf swallowed another landing craft. The radio crackled. The cutter surged forward. The day was only beginning, and retreat was no longer an option. Orders reached the cutter before the sky fully opened. At 0430 hours, charts were unfolded on the bridge, grease pencils circling a narrow strip of water marked with warnings, obstacles, and red ink. This was the surf zone off Normandy, assigned to Coast Guard crews because no one else could hold station there. The mission was simple to state and brutal to execute: remain inside the breakers, retrieve survivors, guide landing craft, and stay put until relieved. The cutter's commanding officer studied the shoreline through salt-streaked glass. He wore a steel helmet instead of a cap, a quiet acknowledgement that this would be no routine patrol. The engine room received orders to maintain maneuvering speed. Too slow meant broaching in the surf. Too fast meant grounding on hidden steel or mines. There was no safe margin. Below decks, rescue lines were coiled and rechecked. Cargo nets were rigged over the side. Life rings were stacked where hands could find them without looking. Crewmen taped identification to their jackets. Some wrote names on their wrists in pencil. Nobody spoke about it. As the first landing waves closed on the beach, the cutter edged forward, crossing a line larger warships would not pass. Naval gunfire thundered overhead, shells screaming inland. Each blast slapped the hull like a hammer. The water turned chaotic: fuel slicks, floating packs, broken planks already drifting seaward. The invasion timetable was slipping in places. Boats were veering. Men were going into the water early. A radio call cut through the noise. A landing craft had taken fire and was shipping water. Its position lay directly inside the cutter's assigned box. The helmsman corrected course, fighting the wheel as a breaker lifted the bow and slammed it down hard. Spray blinded the bridge. The cutter did not turn away. Small arms fire began snapping across the surf, sharp cracks mixed with the deeper thump of mortars. Tracers skimmed the waves, skipping like stones. The cutter's deck guns stayed silent, firing wrist-friendly craft. This ship's weapon was proximity. Its value was refusal. The beach loomed closer now, its obstacles clearer, its violence louder. The cutter held its line as ordered, engines straining, crew braced. Ahead, another craft rolled sideways in the surf, men spilling into the cold water, and the cutter surged toward them without hesitation. Smoke drifted low across the water, masking shapes and distances. The shoreline erupted again, closer this time. Someone shouted from the deck. A hand pointed toward bodies bobbing between waves and wreckage. The cutter answered with throttle, pushing deeper into the fire-swept shallows, where survival lasted seconds, and the hardest decisions had not yet been made. The sea closed in, daring the cutter to flinch. Wind battered the channel as the first assault waves committed to the shore. By 0600 hours on June 6, 1944, the sea had turned violent, a grinding field of gray water and whitecaps that punished every hull. The Coast Guard cutter rode hard, hull lifting and crashing, plates shuddering as green water swept the deck. Steel rang. Men staggered, recovered, and locked themselves into place with rope and muscle. Ahead, the first landing craft broke formation. Ramps dropped early. Soldiers spilled into water chest deep, rifles held high, packs dragging them down. Some were swept sideways by the surf, slammed into obstacles hidden just beneath the surface. The cutter closed fast, engines straining, propellers biting through churned water and debris. Smoke rolled low, blurring distance and turning the shoreline into a shifting wall of shadow. Enemy fire intensified as the tide rose. Machine gun bursts tore across the breakers, stitching the water with sudden violence. Mortar rounds crashed into the surf, throwing columns of spray and steel fragments skyward. The cutter's hull took near misses that slapped metal with concussive force. Paint peeled. Antennas whipped. The bridge shook with every impact. On deck, rescue teams moved with practiced urgency. Nets were thrown. Lines snapped tight. Hands reached down toward helmets, fingers, straps. Men were hauled aboard coughing salt water and blood, uniforms heavy and dark. Some were conscious, eyes wide with shock. Others were limp, dragged clear of the rail and passed aft for what aid could be given while the ship kept moving. The surf zone became a graveyard of equipment. Floating packs. Broken rifles. Splintered planks. Inflated life belts bobbing without owners. Landing craft drifted dead in the water, engines flooded, ramps twisted. The cutter maneuvered between them with inches to spare, risking mines and grounding to reach anyone still moving. Visibility collapsed as smoke thickened. Shore batteries fired blindly through the haze. The sound was relentless, engines screaming, steel grinding, gunfire cracking, waves pounding without rhythm. Orders were passed by hand signals and shouted over the wind, faces set hard beneath steel helmets slick with spray. The cutter held position when instinct demanded withdrawal. Every minute inside the surf multiplied danger. Another craft capsized to starboard. Figures vanished beneath foam. The helmsman fought the wheel as the sea tried to throw the ship sideways. The engines answered with raw power, keeping the bow pointed shoreward. Radio traffic spiked with distress calls, bearings overlapping, voices cut short by static, while the cutter's compass swung wildly, needles trembling as waves and shockwaves fought to tear navigation apart inside the smoke-choked assault corridor under fire. Then a heavier explosion erupted close enough to lift the stern and knock men off their feet. Smoke swallowed the deck. For a breathless moment, nothing was visible but white water and drifting debris. As the cutter steadied, shapes emerged ahead, more men in the water, farther inside the kill zone than before, and the ship surged toward them, deeper into the storm, steel against surf, with no margin left. By mid-morning on June 6, 1944, the surf line had become a killing corridor. The Coast Guard cutter no longer moved between isolated incidents, it moved through a continuous storm of steel and water. Every approach toward the beach meant crossing open lanes swept by machine guns firing from concrete emplacements hidden in smoke. Every turn risked grounding on submerged obstacles or drifting mines torn loose by the tide. The cutter advanced anyway. Waves rose higher as the tide pushed in, smashing the hull sideways and threatening to broach the ship broadside to the shore. The helmsman fought constantly, arms locked, boots braced, sweat and seawater streaking his face. Engine orders came sharp and fast, ahead flank, back emergency, rudder hard over each command, a gamble measured in seconds. One wrong correction would end the mission instantly. The shoreline erupted without warning. German guns raked the surf with disciplined bursts, bullets striking water with sharp cracks that echoed off the bluffs. Tracers flashed red and white through drifting smoke. Mortars landed closer now, detonations lifting sections of sea and throwing shrapnel across the deck. Steel screamed as fragments struck the cutter's superstructure. One blast shattered a light. Another tore loose a railing. No one flinched. On deck, Coast Guard crewmen worked without cover. There was none to be found. They crawled, ran, and clung to lifelines while scanning the water for movement, arms, helmets, faces breaking the surface before disappearing again. Nets went over the side. Lines followed. Men were pulled aboard amid spray and blood, dragged clear as the cutter kept moving forward through the chaos. The surf carried everything at once. Bodies. Equipment. Burning fuel slicks. Pieces of landing craft torn apart by gunfire or waves. Inflated life belts bumped against the hull, some still occupied, others empty. The cutter weaves between wreckage and living men, the margin between rescue and collision measured in feet. A landing craft ahead took a direct hit. Its ramp twisted violently as soldiers spilled into the water, several crushed against steel obstacles before vanishing beneath foam. The cutter surged toward them, closing the distance under full fire. Bullets snapped overhead. One struck the waterline with a dull thud. Another punched through a canvas cover. The ship did not slow. Crewmen leaned over the rail, arms straining as waves tried to tear survivors free. One soldier lost his grip and disappeared. Another was hauled aboard unconscious, helmet gone, face gray. There was no pause to count. No pause to speak. The cutter moved again, turning back into the surf to answer another call already coming over the radio. The soundscape was unbearable. Engines screamed. Waves roared. Gunfire hammered. Orders were shouted until voices cracked. Smoke burned eyes and lungs. The deck grew slick with oil and seawater, boots slipping as men worked on instinct alone. The cutter had crossed deep into waters larger ships avoided. There was no safe exit path now, only narrow lanes between obstacles and fire. As the ship turned once more toward the beach, a fresh burst of machine gun fire stitched the waves directly ahead, walking closer with brutal precision. The helmsman tightened his grip. The engines surged. The cutter drove forward, straight into the teeth of it, knowing the next seconds would decide whether it came out again. At the waterline, order collapsed. By late morning the tide pressed hard against Normandy's obstacles, turning the surf into a grinder of bodies, steel, and wreckage. The Coast Guard cutter hovered inside it, engines surging and backing as waves shoved the hull sideways. Smoke lay thick over the beach. Mud churned beneath foam. Nothing stayed still. Landing craft arrived broken or arrived wrong. Some grounded short, ramps dropping into deep water. Others slammed obstacles and split open, spilling men and gear. Soldiers staggered forward under rifle fire, disappeared, then reappeared closer to the cutter, dragged seaward by undertow. The ship closed again and again, bowsprit nearly touching wreckage, screws churning inches from drowning men. Gunfire cracked constantly from the bluffs. Mortars burst with flat thumps that shook lungs. Shrapnel hissed across the deck and punched into bulkheads. A fragment tore through a life ring. Another gouged steel near the bridge. The cutter answered by holding station, a stubborn gray shape refusing to be pushed out by waves or fear. Rescue became violent work. Crewmen went to their knees, braced against pitching rails, arms locked around slick straps. They hauled men up whose packs dragged them under. Fingers slipped. Knuckles split. One wave smashed a rescuer against the rail, knocking the breath from him, and he rose again without pause. A stretcher appeared. Then another. There was no deck space left that was clean. The water carried evidence of the assault's cost. Rifles without hands. Helmets bobbing like buoys. A radio smashed and sparking. Blood streaked the foam and vanished. The cutter threaded through it, avoiding floating charges and tangled obstacles, navigating by shouted bearings and instinct because the shoreline had vanished behind smoke. A landing craft ahead caught fire. Ammunition cooked off in sharp pops. Men jumped clear, some aflame, some already wounded. The cutter pushed toward them, closer than doctrine allowed, bow rising and falling so sharply the keel threatened to strike. Machine gun bursts walked toward the bridge windows. The helmsman held the course. A wave broke across the deck and swept a survivor toward the scuppers. Hands grabbed him at the last instant. Another man went under and did not come back up. The cutter's engines roared as if angry, fighting water and gravity together. Radio screamed overlapping calls for help, locations blurring into one desperate mass. Time lost meaning at the waterline. Minutes felt endless. The tide kept rising. Fire kept falling. The cutter's hull rang with impacts and near misses, paint flaking away under stress. Still it stayed, pivoting, lunging, backing, returning to the same strip of lethal water because no one else could. As the smoke thinned for a moment, the beach emerged, cliffs scarred, obstacles mangled, men pinned low. Another surge of craft pushed in, already under fire. The cutter turned toward them, deeper than before, and the sea seemed to close behind it, sealing the path out. Orders continued to arrive through broken radio bursts, demanding the cutter guide fresh waves through lanes that no longer existed. The charts were useless now. Landmarks were gone. Smoke erased depth and distance alike. Crewmen pointed, shouted, reacted. The ship shuddered as the keel brushed unseen ground, then lifted free. A burst struck the water beside the bow, close enough to drench the bridge. Another followed, nearer. The cutter held on, inching forward, knowing the next correction might save lives or end the ship in seconds. The surf surged higher, engines strained louder, and every man aboard understood they were balanced on a razor edge between rescue and destruction as fire closed in from shore without warning yet. By early afternoon on June 6, 1944, the Coast Guard cutter had become a fixed point in a moving disaster. While the tide continued to rise, the ship held its position inside the surf zone, engines alternating between strain and restraint as waves battered the hull from all sides. Around it, other craft failed. Some lost power and drifted broadside. Others filled with water and slipped under without warning. The cutter stayed. Smoke hung so low it pressed against the deck. Visibility shrank to seconds. Shapes appeared and vanished in the haze, landing craft, men, wreckage, each demanding an instant decision. The helmsman relied on shouted bearings and the pitch of the sea beneath the keel. The compass swung wildly. The shoreline no longer existed as a clear reference, only noise and fire. A landing craft to port took a direct hit. Its stern dropped, bow lifting sharply before the entire vessel rolled and disappeared. The cutter moved immediately, sliding sideways through broken surf. Men surfaced where the craft had been, gasping, arms flailing. The water dragged at them with cruel strength. Crewmen leaned out, nets and lines dropping, bodies slamming against steel as the ship surged in back to avoid pulling them under. Gunfire intensified. Machine guns fired continuously from the bluffs, their rhythm steady and merciless. Tracers cut through smoke and struck water so close they soaked the bridge windows. Mortar rounds fell short, then closer, detonations flattening the sea around the cutter. Each blast lifted the hull and dropped it again, testing rivets and nerves alike. The cutter took damage. A hit smashed a section of railing. Another tore open a locker and sent gear spilling across the deck. A crewman was knocked down by a wave and dragged before being hauled back by his belt. No one left their station. There was nowhere safer to go. All around, craft that could not hold position were destroyed. Some grounded and burned. Others capsized in the surf, their crews thrown into water already crowded with debris. The cutter remained where it was ordered, marking lanes with its presence, guiding incoming waves by motion alone. Its silhouette became a reference point for boats barely staying afloat. Rescue blurred into endurance. Arms burned. Hands shook. Faces tightened under steel helmets streaked with oil and spray. Men were pulled aboard and passed aft, stacked where space allowed, alive or silent. There was no pause to assess beyond breathing. The ship turned back each time, re-entering the same strip of lethal water because leaving it meant abandoning those still fighting to stay above the waves. The sound never stopped. Engines screamed. Surf roared. Gunfire hammered. Orders came in fragments through radios choked with static. The cutter answered all of them by remaining in place. It held while others went under, absorbing punishment meant for ships already lost. A sudden explosion ahead marked another sinking. Smoke cleared just enough to reveal men struggling farther in than before, nearly at the obstacle line. The cutter edged forward, keel scraping unseen ground before lifting free. The engines protested, then surged. The sea tried to push the ship back. Fire tried to force it down. The cutter stayed where it was needed, balanced between destruction and duty, as another wave of men entered the water ahead and the margin for survival narrowed to moments. By mid-afternoon, damage was no longer cosmetic. The Coast Guard cutter carried scars across her hull, twisted railings, shattered fittings, and decks slick with oil and blood. A near-miss had stove and plating forward, flooding a compartment and forcing pumps to labor without pause. Another blast severed cables, killing lights along the starboard side. The ship was wounded, but still moving. Smoke clung to everything. It filled lungs and eyes, coated instruments, blurred men into silhouettes. The bridge windows were cracked, spiderwebbed by concussion, but still clear enough to see the surf tearing itself apart ahead. The commanding officer stayed forward, helmet strapped tight, hands gripping the rail whenever the deck lurched. Withdrawal was discussed once. It was dismissed immediately. Engineers worked below with water rising around their boots. Steam hissed. Pumps thumped. Valves were cranked shut and reopened by feel alone. Power held by margins so thin no gauge could fully capture them. Above, the ship answered the sea with raw thrust, refusing to lose steerage even as waves hammered the bow. Fire continued to find the cutter. Machine gun rounds cracked against steel with a sound like tearing canvas. One round punched through a locker and ricocheted across the deck. A crewman went down hard, stunned, then rolled clear and stood again. Medics worked where space allowed, kneeling amid coils of line and scattered gear, hands red and shaking. Despite damage, the mission did not bend. The cutter stayed inside the surf zone, guiding landing craft by position and motion. Boats followed her wake, trusting the gray shape ahead to mark safe passage where charts no longer mattered. Each successful run meant more men reached the beach alive. Another craft lost power and drifted helplessly toward obstacles. The cutter closed in, nudging waves aside, risking grounding to throw lines and stabilize the stricken boat. Gunfire walked toward the hull as the rescue unfolded. No one looked back. The engine strained, then answered. The deck grew crowded with survivors. Some lay silent, wrapped in blankets pulled from lockers already damaged. Others clung to rails, staring shoreward, faces hollow. Crewmen moved among them without ceremony, cutting straps, checking pulses, shoving water out of lungs, then turning back to the rail for the next call. The shoreline erupted again, closer than before. A heavier weapon joined the fire, its impacts deeper, more violent. The cutter shuddered as a blast lifted the stern and knocked men to their knees. Alarms sounded briefly, then died. Control was regained. Course held. Damage control parties moved non-stop, plugging seams with timber and canvas, passing tools hand to hand as water crept inward. The smell of burned paint mixed with cordite and diesel. Every repair bought minutes, nothing more. Radios warned of renewed fire. The cutter stayed, counting seconds, not miles. No one believed relief would arrive soon, or that the sea would ease today maybe. The cutter gathered speed, damaged but defiant, pushing forward once more, knowing the next hit might be the one that decided everything. By late afternoon, the sea gave up its survivors reluctantly. The Coast Guard cutter remained inside the surf zone, engines throttling constantly as crewmen scanned the water for any sign of life. The tide had carried men far from where they entered, scattering helmets, packs, and bodies across a wide arc of gray water. Smoke drifted low, turning distance into guesswork. Every recovery demanded precision. Nets dropped over the side while the helmsman balanced thrust against breaking waves. Too close and the hull would crush a man. Too far and the surf would pull him under again. Arms reached down, fingers locking onto straps, collars, bare wrists. Men came aboard coughing seawater in oil, eyes wide, lips blue, hands clawing until steel felt solid. Some survivors fought rescue in panic, striking blindly as waves slammed them against the hull. Crewmen absorbed the blows, held fast, hauled them in anyway. Others were limp, faces slack beneath helmets filled with water. Those were lifted carefully, laid flat, rolled, pressed, breathed for. Medics worked without pause, cutting webbing, tearing open jackets, clearing airways while the ship never stopped moving. The water around the cutter told its own story. Inflated life belts bobbed empty. Rifles drifted muzzle down. A boot floated past, then vanished beneath foam. Each object marked someone the cutter had not reached in time. There was no space to dwell on it. Another arm broke the surface farther out, then another. The cutter surged forward again, deeper toward the obstacle line. Fire still fell sporadically from shore, bullets skipping across the water with sharp cracks. Mortars landed farther inland now, but shrapnel continued to hiss overhead. The crew ignored it, eyes locked on the sea, reading movement in the chaos. Survivors crowded the deck. Some sat shaking, wrapped in blankets scavenged from damaged lockers. Others lay motionless, tagged quickly and moved aside. The deck became a narrow island of breathing space surrounded by violence. Orders passed hand to hand. Water was forced between lips. Names were asked, then written down if answers came. As daylight shifted, exhaustion settled in hard and sudden. Arms trembled. Backs burned. Hands lost feeling. Still the cutter held position, turning and backing, returning to the same lethal water again and again. No one asked how long it had been. Time existed only in breaths and heartbeats. Then the sea heaved violently as something detonated nearby. Spray swallowed the bow. When it cleared, new figures appeared in the water closer to shore than before, drifting fast toward submerged steel. The cutter turned immediately, engines rising in protest, pushing once more into danger to reach them before the surf finished what the fire had started. It was a race measured in seconds, against water, gravity, and gunfire, with no guarantee of victory. The cutter closed the gap, bow lifting, nets ready, knowing failure meant watching men vanish beneath waves while history moved on without mercy. Every approach narrowed options, demanded courage, and punished hesitation with immediate, irreversible consequence alone. Late in the day on June 6, 1944, the sea began to change its rhythm. The tide that had dragged men under all morning now pushed steadily inland, carrying fresh waves of landing craft toward beaches no longer completely exposed. Smoke still hung heavy, but through it came a new sound: rifle fire from the sand, moving forward instead of backward. The Coast Guard cutter felt it before anyone said it. Radio traffic shifted. Distress calls slowed. The frantic overlap of voices gave way to clearer orders. Army units were establishing footholds. Engineers were clearing lanes. Naval gunfire had crept farther inland, pounding positions that had dominated the surf hours earlier. The cutter remained where it had been all day, engines idling just enough to hold station. Around it, the water was calmer, though still littered with wreckage. Fewer arms broke the surface now. Fewer cries carried over the wind. The work was not finished, but it had changed. Crewmen leaned against rails when they could, chests heaving, hands numb. Faces were streaked with salt and soot. Helmets bore fresh dents. The deck was scarred, cluttered with torn nets, spent gear, and men wrapped in blankets who had survived because the cutter stayed. Medics continued to work, quieter now, movements slower but no less deliberate. Another landing wave moved past, engines roaring, soldiers packed tight but upright. They followed channels that did not exist that morning, guided by the cutter's position and the sacrifice already paid in the water. Some men on deck watched them go in silence. Others turned away, already scanning for movement in the sea out of habit they could not yet shed. Shore fire still cracked occasionally, but its edge was gone. The bluffs that had dominated the surf were now scarred and contested. Smoke lifted just enough to reveal movement inland, men advancing, flags planted, medics working under fire on sand instead of steel decks. The invasion had not succeeded yet, but it was no longer failing. The cutter received new orders. Shift position slightly seaward. Prepare to guide traffic through cleared lanes. Stand by for night operations. No mention was made of withdrawal. The ship had earned its place here. As the sun dropped behind the smoke, the water reflected a dim, broken light. Wreckage drifted slowly now, no longer racing toward shore or sea. The cutter's engines eased, then steadied, holding her in place one last time as daylight faded from the most violent hours. For the first time since dawn, the men aboard allowed themselves to believe the beach would hold. But as darkness approached and the sounds of battle shifted inland, new dangers gathered offshore, unseen and waiting. The cutter stayed alert, knowing night would bring its own tests, and survival was never guaranteed simply because the tide had turned. When darkness finally settled over Normandy on June 6, 1944, the Coast Guard cutters remained where they had been all day, close enough to the shore to hear distant rifle fire, far enough to keep their screws clear of wreckage. The sea, exhausted at last, rolled more evenly beneath battered hulls. Smoke drifted inland. The surf no longer screamed. On the cutter's deck, silence replaced urgency. Rescue lines lay coiled and unused. Nets dripped seawater in the fading light. Men sat where they stood, backs against steel, helmets resting at their feet. Some stared toward the beach they had never set foot on. Others looked only at the water, as if expecting it to demand more. The ship itself told the story better than any report. Scorched paint. Bent railings. Shattered fittings hastily lashed back into place. Below decks, pumps still ran, steady and stubborn, keeping the sea at bay. The cutter had taken punishment meant for larger ships and had stayed exactly where it was needed. No ceremony followed. No flags were raised. Orders arrived quietly: maintain patrol through the night, guide traffic, recover anyone still found alive. The work continued without pause, just slower now, shaped by darkness instead of smoke. The men obeyed because that was what they had done since dawn. Across the channel, history would remember Omaha and Utah, cliffs and hedgerows, divisions and generals. Few would mark the narrow strip of water where Coast Guard cutters held position hour after hour, pulling men from drowning, guiding waves through fire, absorbing chaos so others could move forward. The surf zone would fade from memory first, erased by tide and time. But the legacy remained. Every soldier who reached the beach because a cutter stayed. Every landing craft that followed a gray hull through shattered lanes. Every life pulled from the sea in those critical hours. The invasion did not succeed because of one moment alone, it survived because someone refused to leave their post. As night deepened, distant flares rose inland, and artillery thunder rolled farther away. The cutter's engines idled, ready. Watches were set. The sea, calm now, hid its earlier violence well. Tomorrow would bring new orders, new dangers, and more loss. For the men aboard, there would be no medals handed out on deck that night. Only the knowledge that when the surf was most lethal, they stayed. And as the channel closed over the last wreckage of D-Day, the cutter held on in the darkness, alert and scarred, knowing history rarely speaks of quiet courage until it is gone.